I still hear it sometimes, late at night when the world goes quiet and the old memories crawl back out of the dark corners where I try to keep them buried. That voice, that clipped, arrogant, perfectly enunciated German accent cutting through the cold, damp air of our forward command post like a blade through silk, and the words, God. Those words have never left me in all the decades since that April morning in 1945. We are professional officers of the Wehrmacht, and we demand quarters that befit our rank and our station. I was standing maybe 12 feet away. My name is James Walker from rural Tennessee, still carrying the smell of Dachau in my uniform, still seeing the boxcars every time I close my eyes. My hands were shaking, not from the cold. They were shaking because I was holding myself back from doing something that would have ended my military career and quite possibly my life. But then General George S. Patton walked through that door, and everything changed. Before I take you back to that moment, I need you to understand the world that existed inside my chest that specific morning. Because if you do not understand what I had seen in the hours before those German officers made their demands, you cannot possibly understand why what happened next was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of mercy, mercy toward the truth. It came to us before we could see anything. The history books always get this slightly wrong. They describe the liberation of Dachau as a visual experience, but the eyes were the last thing to understand what we were walking into. The smell reached us first, drifting on that cold Bavarian spring wind, like something that had no right to exist in the natural world. I had been in combat long enough that certain smells had stopped affecting me. The iron tang of blood, the sulfur of artillery. War reshapes your senses. I had believed, genuinely believed, that after everything I had witnessed from North Africa through Italy and into Germany, I had reached some kind of emotional bedrock, some floor beneath which I could not sink further. I was catastrophically wrong. The smell settled into the back of your throat and sat there. It did not leave. Private Henderson, a big farm kid from Iowa, who I had watched walk through artillery barrages without flinching, suddenly bent over by the side of the road and was violently sick in the mud. None of us said anything. There was nothing to say. When the gates came into view, the world as I had previously understood it simply ceased to exist. The death train was the first thing that stopped us cold. 39 railway boxcars sitting motionless on the spur line, silent and patient, like some terrible monument that had been waiting years for someone to finally arrive and bear witness. Our lieutenant ordered us to open them. I was one of the soldiers who pulled back the heavy wooden doors. I will not describe in full detail what we found inside. I have spent 80 years trying to find language adequate to the task, and I have always failed. What I will tell you is this. Those were human beings, fathers and mothers, children, people who had names and histories and dreams, who had once sat at dinner tables and laughed at jokes and held their loved ones close. They had been packed into those boxcars like cargo and left to die. I remember the exact sound Private Danny Kowalski made when he looked inside. He was 20 years old. He made a sound I had never heard a human being make before and have never heard since. A low, keening noise that seemed to come from somewhere beneath language, beneath conscious thought. I remember sitting down in the gravel because my legs had stopped working. That was the morning of April 29th, 1945. By early afternoon, our unit had helped establish a command post in a farmhouse 2 miles from the camp. The smell still reached us there. When the captured German officers were brought in, the visual reality of them was so jarring it made me question my own sanity. Their uniforms were pressed. I want you to sit with that detail, not just clean, pressed, with sharp, deliberate creases. Their boots held a mirror shine, their iron crosses gleamed. They stood with chins lifted in that Prussian way, that posture of absolute unshakable entitlement. They looked at those of us guarding them the way a man looks at a muddy stray dog that has wandered into his parlor. Then the senior officer stepped forward and began to speak. He spoke about the Geneva Convention, about proper accommodations, hot water, quarters separated from enlisted men, his rank, his station, his rights as a gentleman officer of a civilized nation. He spoke for about 3 minutes. The room was utterly silent when he finished. I looked at my hands. They were shaking again, but differently now. Not the trembling of grief. This was something harder and hotter and darker. Every soldier in that room was thinking the same thought. We talked about it afterward quietly, the way men talk about things that came very close to happening. We were all balanced on the same razor's edge between the law we had sworn to uphold and a rage so pure it had its own terrible clarity. It was at that exact moment that the door opened. I had seen General Patton before, at a distance, the way most enlisted men experienced great commanders, as a distant weather phenomenon existing in a different atmospheric layer than the rest of us. But I had never been in a room with him. He was not the largest man physically. That surprised me. But when he walked through that door, something happened to the air. The room changed. It was the same room, with the same mud-caked walls, and the same exhausted soldiers, and the same pristine German officers. But it was entirely different, because Patton was now inside it. His eyes moved across the scene in about 3 seconds, and understood everything. I watched his face process the sight of those immaculate officers with their complaints still hanging in the air. I watched something move behind his eyes that was not simply anger. Anger is loud and hot and relatively simple. What moved across Patton's face was deeper and colder and far more purposeful. It was moral fury. The face of a man who has looked into the absolute worst humanity can produce and has now been confronted in the same afternoon with the architects of that worst standing around, complaining about their accommodations. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to me. His voice dropped to something very quiet and very controlled, and far more frightening than any shout I had ever heard. "Sergeant," he said, "you were at the camp this morning." It was not a question. "Yes, sir," I said. "Then you are going to help me give these gentlemen the tour they deserve." What Patton said to those German officers I can only describe in its general character, because the specific language was not fit for polite company. He told them their status as officers and gentlemen had been permanently revoked. Not by him, not by the American military, by themselves, by their own choices, the regime they had served, the system they had protected, the comfortable ignorance they had performed so expertly for so long. He told them the Geneva Convention was written to protect soldiers, and that what he had seen at the camps represented a declaration that they had removed themselves from the category of soldier entirely. Then he turned to me and gave the order. March them, on foot, through the mud, all the way to the gate. No vehicles, no rain protection, no gentle handling. March them the way the people in those boxcars would have given anything to be marched, on their own feet, alive under an open sky, with the future still theoretically possible. I was at the front of the escort, close enough to see and hear everything. The transformation began almost immediately. These were men who had moved through the world their entire lives on the cushion of rank and breeding and institutional authority. The physical world had been managed for them. Now they were in the mud. Real mud. The kind that grabs your boots and holds them and makes every step a small, exhausting negotiation. The mirror shine on their boots lasted approximately 4 minutes. Some slipped. When they went down on one knee, my fellow soldiers did not offer a hand. We used rifle butts, as ordered, firmly, purposefully, to keep the march moving. No cruelty beyond what was necessary, no abuse beyond what was required, but no gentleness either, no deference, no acknowledgement of rank. The smell hit them about a quarter-mile out. I was watching for it. I watched the moment it reached them, men who had spent years ensuring they never had to know that smell existed. One gagged immediately, a reflexive convulsion his aristocratic training had no mechanism to suppress. Another turned his face aside, visibly fighting the biological revolt in his stomach. "Keep moving," I said. "Eyes forward." I have spent many years thinking about what Patton did that afternoon, and the older I get, the more convinced I become it was one of the most important acts of moral clarity in the entire history of that war. Not because it was kind, it was not designed to be, but because it was true. Patton understood something that the more diplomatically inclined among the Allied command were already beginning to lose sight of. Because the war was ending, and there were geopolitical considerations and pressure, even then, even in April 1945, with the ashes still warm, to begin the long process of moving forward and being civilized about the whole business. Patton understood that civilization itself depended on not being civilized about this particular business. He understood that there are moments in history when forcing people to confront the unfiltered truth of what they have done is not cruelty. It is the only possible foundation on which anything resembling justice or healing or genuine prevention can be built. He turned to me at the end of it, as the MPs prepared to move the prisoners to the proper holding facility. His face was absolutely unreadable in the way that only truly great commanders can manage, containing a storm so completely that there is no surface disturbance at all. "Remember this, Sergeant," he said. That was all. Just those 3 words. We are living, right now, in a world under constant pressure to forget. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, in the careful and entirely deniable way that comfortable people have always preferred to forget things that complicate the self-image of nations and institutions. The Holocaust deniers have not gone away. They have simply learned to dress their denial in more sophisticated language. The vocabulary of historical revisionism, alternative perspectives, the need to hear all sides. The mechanisms that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil, the willingness to look away, the comfort found in institutional authority, the psychological distance between policy and consequence, those are not historical artifacts. They are permanent features of the human condition. This is why the story of what happened in that farmhouse and on that 1.5 miles of muddy road matters beyond the specific men involved. Those German officers could not file it away after that afternoon. Whatever else is true about them, they could never again claim, even to themselves, that they did not know. Not after the smell, not after the graves, not after looking into the faces of the survivors who looked back with eyes that had seen the full truth of what those officers had built. Patton gave them that. It was not a gift anyone would choose to receive, but it was the only honest thing left to give. I am an old man now. Most of the men I served with are gone. Henderson, Kowalski, Williams, all of them gone, along with most of the others who stood in that camp on that April morning and tried to make sense of what the world had shown them. I carry them with me. I carry April 29th, 1945 with me every day. Not as a weight exactly, but as a permanent orientation, a fixed point from which all other moral navigation proceeds. When I hear people speak casually about the lessons of history, when I hear the subtle arguments for why we should soften certain edges, contextualize certain horrors, consider complicating factors that make the story less starkly clear, I think about General Patton turning to me in that farmhouse and telling me we were going to give those officers the tour they deserved, and I think about what I saw on their faces when the tour was over. What I know is the version I lived. The version where a general with mud on his boots and fire in his eyes understood that the most important thing he could do was not negotiate or accommodate or be diplomatically strategic about the sensibilities of men who had forfeited any claim to diplomatic consideration. The most important thing he could do was make sure they could never say they did not know. He turned to me and gave the order, and I carried it out. And I have never, not for one single day in all the years since, believed it was the wrong thing to do, Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these intense historical stories and untold battlefield moments with Patton at the center, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps these powerful, story-driven explorations alive. Now tell us in the comments, if you were standing beside me during that moment when Patton gave that brutal order, what would you have done? And if you had to carve one final message into history, something strong enough to survive 12,000 years, what would you leave behind? We'll see you in the next chapter of this story.